For nearly half a century, the Republic had taken pride in his achievements as soldier and pacificator. And if he now lived in a glorious military past, so did his fellow countrymen. He was the very figure to satisfy a peaceful people, fond of bragging of its bygone belligerents. The general was as magnificent as a monument, and no one was troubled by the circumstance that he was nearly as useless. Smugly aloof from the dissensions of Europe, the young nation scorned the large standing armies of the Old World. It was wary of the political danger of a large military class, and regarding high rank as perilous to democratic liberties, looked uneasily on West Point as a breeding ground for aristocrats. Save for George Washington, Winfield Scott alone had held the rank of lieutenant general, and in his case Congress had conferred it only by brevet. To guard its far-flung borders and fight its Indian wars, the United States maintained an army of 16,000 soldiers, scattered for the most part over the Pacific coast, Utah, and the Southwest. This small establishment offered a limited opportunity for military preferment, and in the 20 years of Scott's command, he had shown a marked partiality for advancing Southern officers. To favor a gentleman from the slave states, with their martial spirit and their habit of command, had been as natural to the old Virginian as a daily perusal of the Richmond Enquirer. Of the 6 Army departments, only the Department of the East was commanded by a Northerner, General John E. Wool. The 5 Western departments, in which the mass of the Army was stationed, were all headed by officers of Southern birth. Scott found the Southern rascals not only meritorious but congenial. The only Northern aide on his staff was his military secretary, Lieutenant Colonel E.D. Keyes, and the appointment had first been offered to a Virginian, Colonel Robert E. Lee. Since the nation's political destinies had long been controlled by the statesmen of the slave states, there had been no interference with the general's predilections. For 12 years, the War Department patronage had been in Southern hands. A Southern clique ruled the Army, and many ambitious Northerners who had shown promise at West Point, Halleck, McClellan, Hooker, Burnside, Sherman, Rosecrans, had felt sufficiently discouraged to resign their commissions and return to civil life. In spite of his sentiment for the South, General Scott was no believer in state sovereignty. He was strongly attached to the Union. In the presidential election of 1852, he had been the last standard-bearer of the dying Whig Party, overwhelmingly defeated by the Democratic candidate Franklin Pierce, a New Englander of Southern sympathies. Scott had spent much time in the North, and when Pierce took office, he moved his headquarters from Washington to New York. There, growing old and feeble, he had remained, while North and South, with increasing bitterness, disputed the question of the extension of slavery to the territories, and abolitionists vied with fire-eaters in a chorus of recrimination and hatred. In 1856, the anti-slavery Republican Party entered the national lists, captained by the gallant adventurer Fremont. Again a Democrat, James Buchanan, was elected president, but the North's growing antipathy to slavery was written in the large Republican vote. The canvass of 1860 revealed a disastrous sectional division. The Democratic Party split into 2 factions, each of which nominated a candidate, and the success of the Republicans in November appeared to be assured. After the October elections, the Cotton States began to agitate for disunion. South Carolina threatened immediate secession if the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, should be elected. In late October, General Scott wrote the president a letter containing his views. He advised Buchanan that the Southern forts should be strongly garrisoned to prevent a surprise attack. It was the advice that the general had given President Jackson during the nullification troubles in South Carolina, when Scott himself had gone to Charleston and executed his mission with firmness and diplomacy. Scott was no longer the man he had been in 1832. His letter maundered off into arguments for peaceable disunion, and he presented the suggestion that the nation might solve its problems, not simply by splitting in half, but by dividing into 4 confederacies. A week after he had sent his letter, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. 4 days later, South Carolina called a convention with the view of seceding from the Union. There were wild political demonstrations in the Cotton States, and as Southern trade with the North fell off and markets fell and banks called in their loans, the Free States, forgetful of their recent enthusiasm for the limitation of slavery,